She saw it before anyone else. A faint cloudiness in the scotch, a shimmer that didn't belong. And in the 3 seconds it took her to decide, Jessie Brown went from invisible to irreplaceable. In a city built on silence and power, one woman's instinct was about to drag her into a world she was never meant to survive, and into the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Welcome to our channel, where broken men find redemption in the most unexpected places, and where love is the only rebellion that matters. If stories of courage, danger, and second chances make your heart race, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one. Now, let's find out what happens when you save the wrong man's life. The iron veil smelled like old leather and expensive mistakes. Jessie wiped down the mahogany counter for the 3rd time, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands needed something to do. Thursday nights were always like this. The quiet hum of men who didn't raise their voices because they didn't need to. Crystal glasses catching amber light. Conversations held in undertones, where the most dangerous words were the ones left unsaid. She'd worked here 11 months. Long enough to learn the rules. Don't make eye contact longer than a greeting requires. Don't remember names. Don't hear anything. Jessie was very good at rules. She was also very good at noticing things she wasn't supposed to. The man at the far end of the bar had arrived 20 minutes ago, flanked by 2 others who sat 1 stool apart, close enough to intervene, far enough to pretend they weren't watching. He wore a black suit that fit like it had been sewn onto his body, a watch that caught the light every time he lifted his hand, and an expression that suggested the entire room existed at his discretion. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. Men like him had a gravity that bent the air around them, and everyone in the iron veil leaned slightly away when he walked past, the way trees bend before a storm they can feel but can't see. He'd ordered Macallan 18. Neat. Jessie had poured it herself, but the glass that reached him wasn't the one she'd poured. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, not with intention, but with the quiet, relentless pattern recognition that had kept her alive in places far less elegant than this bar. The color was off, a fraction darker, a faint opalescence along the surface that dissolved as she watched, like oil swallowed by water. And the smell. When she'd leaned close enough to place a napkin, her trained nose caught something beneath the peat and smoke. Something acrid. Chemical. Wrong. Her stomach dropped. She looked at Marco, the other bartender, sliding back behind the counter with a cloth over his shoulder and a smile that showed too many teeth. He didn't look at the man. He didn't look at Jessie. He looked at absolutely nothing, with the careful precision of someone who had practiced looking at nothing. 3 seconds. That's what she had. The man's hand was already reaching for the glass, fingers closing around the crystal with the casual certainty of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt what was placed in front of him. Jessie grabbed a napkin. Her pen moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory from years of scribbling orders, phone numbers, reminders to herself on scraps of paper. 2 words. Black ink on white paper. She slid it under his glass as she placed a fresh water beside it, the movement so smooth it looked rehearsed. Her fingers brushed the cold crystal. His fingers were already there. For 1 fraction of a second, their hands touched. He looked down. Don't drink. His eyes lifted to hers, dark brown, almost black in the low light, and so still they didn't seem to belong to a living person. No surprise, no confusion, just a silence that felt like the moment before a sigh. Detonation. Everything suspended, waiting. Jessie held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at Marco. Then back. The man's jaw tightened. A single, almost imperceptible shift, the muscle along his jawline flexing beneath skin that hadn't seen sunlight as a leisure activity. He set the glass down, didn't push it away, didn't draw attention. Simply released it, as though he'd lost interest. Then he raised 2 fingers, a gesture so small, Jessie would have missed it if she hadn't been watching. The men on either side stood simultaneously, like shadows obeying a single puppeteer. One of them walked toward Marco, the other walked toward Jessie. She didn't have time to step back. A hand closed around her upper arm, not violent, but absolute. The kind of grip that communicated a single, non-negotiable truth. You're coming with us. That's not, she started. Don't, the man beside her said quietly. Not here. She was guided through a door she'd never been allowed to open. Down, a corridor that smelled like concrete and cold air, and into the back seat of a black car that was already running. The leather was warm. The windows were tinted so dark the city disappeared. Jessie's breath came in shallow pulls. Her hands trembled in her lap. The same hands that had been steady enough to slide a napkin 3 minutes ago now shook like they belonged to someone else. The man in the black suit sat across from her. The car moved. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for one terrible, irrational moment, Jessie thought about the gun she was certain he carried. Instead, he pulled out the napkin. Her napkin. 2 words in her handwriting, already smudged by the condensation of a glass that might have killed him. He held it between 2 fingers like evidence. Which, she realized with a sickening clarity, it was. You have a sharp eye, he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. Mediterranean, maybe. Italian. Consonants softened by decades of American English. Jessie said nothing. The man who poured that drink has worked for me for 6 years. He folded the napkin once, precisely, and slipped it back into his pocket. You've worked at that bar for less than 1, and you saw what he did before any of my people did. He leaned forward slightly. The car's interior light caught the sharp angles of his face. High cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once, and a mouth set in a line that seemed designed to withhold information. So the question is simple, he said. Who are you, and how did you know? Jessie's throat was dry. I'm a bartender, she said, and the drink looked wrong. Wrong how? The color, the surface tension, and it smelled like something that doesn't belong in scotch. He studied her the way someone studies a lock they haven't decided whether to pick or break. What's your name? She hesitated. Giving him her name felt like handing over a key to a door she couldn't close again. Jessie, she said. Jessie Brown. He nodded once. Not a greeting. An acquisition. Jessie Brown, he repeated, as though tasting the syllables for weaknesses. You just saved my life, which means, unfortunately for you, your life is now my concern. The car turned onto Lakeshore Drive. Through the dark glass, the city lights bled into streaks of gold and white, beautiful and unreachable, like a world she was already leaving behind. The mansion appeared like a mirage. Through the rain-streaked window, stone and iron rising from the darkness of a tree-lined street on the North Shore, set back from the road by a gate that opened without anyone touching it. Jessie counted 3 cameras before the car stopped. There were probably a dozen more she couldn't see. Inside, the air was warm. Not the aggressive, dry warmth of a bar heater struggling against Chicago's December. This was something deeper, embedded in the walls themselves. Radiant heat. Hardwood floors. That didn't creak. The scent of cedar, and something darker, resinous, like incense that had been burning so long it had become part of the architecture. Jessie stood in the foyer with her arms crossed, still wearing her bartender's apron, still smelling like spilled bourbon and lemon peel, and felt the full absurdity of her existence in this space. Everything around her whispered wealth so old it didn't need to announce itself, the kind of money that bought silence, loyalty, and apparently, people. Olivieri Trentino stood 6 feet away, removing his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man who had never been rushed in his life. Underneath, his shoulders were broader than the suit suggested. Athletic, dense, the body of someone who maintained control over every physical detail, the way he maintained control over everything else. "You'll stay here," he said. Not a question. "I have an apartment," Jessie replied. "A cat. A shift tomorrow at noon." "Your apartment is being watched. As of 30 minutes ago. Your cat will be collected. Your shift has been covered." The efficiency of it hit her like cold water. Not the words themselves, but the speed. The machinery that had already moved around her while she sat in the back of his car, still believing she had a choice. "You can't just keep me here." He turned to face her. The foyer light caught his eyes differently than the bar had. They were brown, she saw now, a deep, layered brown like stained wood, and they held the kind of patience that only truly dangerous men could afford. "The man who poisoned my drink didn't act alone," he said. "Which means someone inside my organization authorized it. Which means I don't know who I can trust. And you." He paused, studying her with that same quiet intensity. "You are the only person in that bar tonight who saw what happened and chose to act. That makes you either extraordinarily perceptive or extraordinarily involved. I'm a bartender who noticed bad scotch. You're a witness, and until I know who ordered my death, witnesses don't leave my sight." Jessie's jaw tightened. She could feel the walls of this beautiful house pressing in, the warmth suddenly claustrophobic, the cedar scent too sweet. "So I'm a prisoner." "You're alive," he corrected. "Marco isn't." The silence that followed was surgical. Jessie's stomach turned, not from the implication of violence, which she'd expected, but from the casual precision of the delivery. Marco was dead. The man who'd smiled too wide and poured poison like it was part of the evening service was dead, and Olivieri Trentino spoke about it the way someone mentions a canceled appointment. She swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" "Right now, I want you to sleep. There's a room prepared on the second floor. Clothes will be provided. Food is available in the kitchen. Mrs. Callahan manages the house and she doesn't ask questions, which is a quality I recommend you adopt. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, we talk. Properly." He moved toward the staircase, then stopped, half-turned. The light carved shadows beneath his cheekbones, making him look older, harder, like a man built from the same stone as his house. "You have good instincts, Jessie Brown. I'd advise you to keep using them." He disappeared up the stairs. Two men she hadn't noticed materialized near the front door, standing with the relaxed alertness of people who were paid to be walls. Jessie stood alone in the foyer of a mafioso's mansion on a Thursday night in December, wearing a stained apron and holding nothing. No phone, no keys, no plan. She climbed the stairs because there was nowhere else to go. The room was beautiful in the way that expensive hotels are beautiful. Impersonal, immaculate, designed to comfort without revealing anything about its owner. A queen bed with white linens pulled tight. A window overlooking a garden that was, in December, nothing but skeletal branches and frozen ground. An ensuite. Bathroom with towels thicker than any she'd ever owned. On the bed, folded neatly, a gray sweater, cotton pants, wool socks. Simple. Not her size, slightly too large, the way men's clothes are when chosen by someone who's never bought anything for a woman. Jessie sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against her thighs to stop the shaking. She replayed the evening in her mind. The glass, the shimmer, the napkin, his eyes, and tried to locate the exact moment she'd stopped being a bartender named Jessie Brown and started being something else. A witness, a prisoner, a problem someone with power needed to solve. Her gaze fell on the window. The garden below was dark, but beyond the tree line, she could see the faint glow of the city, amber and distant, like a fire burning in a room she could no longer reach. She wondered briefly if Marco had a family, if someone was waiting for him to come home tonight, if the last thing he saw was the face of the man whose drink he'd poisoned, or if it was quicker than that. She pulled the sweater over her head. It smelled like detergent and cedar, the same scent that permeated the entire house, as though Olivieri Trentino's presence had soaked into the very fibers of everything he owned. Jessie didn't sleep. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, listening to the silence of a house that cost more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes, and thought about the 2 words she'd written on a napkin. 2 words. And now she was here. In the room down the hall, though she didn't know it, Olivieri Trentino sat at his desk with the napkin unfolded before him, staring at her handwriting like a man studying a cipher. He'd been betrayed before. By allies, by blood, by the very structure he'd built to protect himself. Betrayal was the native language of his world. He'd learned to read it, anticipate it, survive it. But he had never once been saved by a stranger. His consigliere, Victor, had called 17 minutes after they left the bar. The scotch contained thallium, slow-acting, nearly undetectable, lethal within 72 hours without treatment. Professional, precise, expensive. Someone hadn't just wanted him dead. They'd wanted him to die quietly, in his own bed, days later, while they repositioned assets and redrew maps of power. This wasn't rage. This was arithmetic. Olivieri leaned back in his chair and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. The leather creaked beneath him. Outside his window. The same garden Jessie stared at from below, stretched into darkness. A bartender. Of all the people in that room, his soldiers, his allies, the men paid to die for him. A bartender with sharp eyes and a cheap pen had been the one to keep him alive. He folded the napkin again and placed it in his desk drawer, beside a photograph he never looked at and a letter he'd never sent. Tomorrow, he would find out exactly what Jessie Brown could see. Tonight, he would sit with the uncomfortable truth that he owed his life to a woman who had no reason to save it. Morning came through the window like an interrogation, pale, relentless December light that made the bedroom feel even more unfamiliar. Jessie woke with a jolt, disoriented by the silence. No traffic, no upstairs neighbor dragging furniture at 6 a.m., no radiator clanking its mechanical death rattle. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that money buys. She found the bathroom stocked with basics. Toothbrush still in plastic, soap. That smelled like bergamot, a comb. Her reflection startled her. Dark circles pressed beneath her blue eyes like thumbprints. Her dark blonde hair tangled at the temples, her skin pale enough to map the veins at her wrists. She looked like someone who'd been pulled from wreckage, which, in a sense, she had. Downstairs, the kitchen was vast and warm. Mrs. Callahan, a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned back and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing chaos for decades, set a plate of eggs and toast on the counter without comment. Coffee materialized seconds later in a ceramic mug heavy enough to use as a weapon. "Thank you," Jessie said. Mrs. Callahan nodded. That was it. No questions, no introductions, no curiosity in her gray eyes. As though women in borrowed sweaters appearing at breakfast in a mafioso's kitchen was simply part of the weekly routine. Jessie ate because her body demanded it, though everything tasted like cardboard and adrenaline residue. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when he appeared. Olivieri entered the kitchen like weather. The temperature shifted, the air pressure changed, and every molecule in the room seemed to rearrange itself around his presence. He wore a dark charcoal sweater over a white shirt, sleeves pushed to his forearms, revealing a watch that caught the morning light and the edge of dark ink, a tattoo disappearing beneath the fabric. His jaw was freshly shaved, his dark hair precise, and those brown eyes found her immediately, as though he'd known exactly where she'd be sitting. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Is that a question?" "An observation." He poured his own coffee, black, no sugar, and leaned against the counter across from her. The kitchen island between them felt like a negotiating table. "How are your eyes this morning?" "Attached to my face." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, but the ghost of one, quickly suppressed. "I meant your observational skills. We have work to do." He led her to a room on the first floor she hadn't seen, a study lined with dark wood shelves and a desk large enough to land a small aircraft. 2 monitors glowed on its surface. Victor was already there, a lean man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the expression of someone who found the world perpetually disappointing. "Miss Brown." Victor's acknowledgement carried the warmth of a tax audit. "Mr. Trentino tells me you have a particular skill set." "I notice things," Jessie said. "She reads people," Olivieri corrected, sitting behind the desk. "She read a room full of trained men and saw what none of them did. That's not noticing. That's a language." It was, and he was right, though Jessie had never had someone name it so precisely. Her mother had called it too sensitive. Her college linguistics professor had called it exceptional paralinguistic awareness. Her ex-boyfriend had called it creepy and stopped, taking her to parties. What it meant, practically, was this. Jessie processed human behavior the way a musician processes sound. Micro-expressions, vocal pitch shifts, the rhythm of someone's breathing when they lied, the way a person's hands moved when their words and intentions diverged. She read the subtitles of human interaction that most people didn't even know existed. Victor played her a recording. 2 men speaking on the phone, both in English, but one with a thick accent she identified as Sicilian within 3 seconds. "The conversation is about a shipment," Victor said. "Routine logistics." "No, it isn't." Jessie leaned closer. "Play the section at 40 seconds again." Victor obliged, his skepticism visible in every crease of his forehead. "There," Jessie said. "He says the schedule is confirmed." But his pitch drops on confirmed. It's a stress marker. And he pauses before schedule for a fraction too long. He's substituting a word. Schedule isn't what he means. Victor stared at her. Olivieri didn't move. "He's talking about a person," Jessie continued. "Someone with a timeline. The schedule is confirmed means someone has agreed to something, and it isn't a delivery." Silence filled the study like smoke. "Play me more," Jessie said. They gave her 6 more recordings over the next 4 hours. She sat with headphones in, yellow legal pad filling with notes in a handwriting that was half shorthand, half linguistic notation. She identified 3 distinct speakers. One was lying consistently, one was afraid, and one, the voice that appeared on 4 of the 6 recordings, spoke with the deliberate, measured cadence of someone who had been trained to control information. "This one's not a soldier," Jessie said, tapping the pad. "This is someone educated, financially literate. He uses hedging language, potentially, in the event that, contingent upon. That's boardroom vocabulary, not street vocabulary. And he code switches when he thinks the other party can't follow, drops into financial jargon to obscure meaning." Olivieri stood behind her. She could feel his presence without turning. The warmth of him, the faint scent of something clean and woody, the controlled stillness that was more unsettling than movement. "You're describing my financial controller," he said quietly. "I'm describing a voice on a tape," Jessie corrected. "But yes, that voice belongs to someone who handles your money and is having conversations he shouldn't be having with people who want you dead." The room held its breath. Victor removed his glasses and cleaned them, a gesture Jessie recognized as his version of panic. Olivieri placed one hand on the back of her chair, not touching her, close enough that she could feel the heat through the borrowed sweater. "His name is Gerald Stein," Olivieri said. "He's managed my family's finances for 12 years. He was at my father's funeral. He sends my mother flowers on her birthday. He's also funneling information to someone who put thallium in your scotch," Jessie said. She didn't soften it. She'd learned long ago that softening truth didn't make it less true. It just gave people permission to ignore it. Olivieri's hand tightened on the chair. She heard the leather creak under his grip. "Keep going," he said. That evening, Jessie sat in the study alone. The monitors had been turned off, the recordings filed, and Victor had left with the expression of a man carrying a bomb he wasn't sure how to defuse. She should have been afraid. She was, in the technical sense. Her cortisol levels were probably setting records, and her hands still trembled if she held them unsupported. But beneath the fear was something else. Something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. At the bar, she'd been invisible. A competent ghost pouring drinks for men who looked through her. Here, in this terrible, beautiful house, a dangerous man looked at her like she was the most important person in the room. It was intoxicating. And she knew, with the same instinct that had spotted poison in a glass, that intoxication was the most dangerous thing of all. 3 days in, and the mansion had developed a rhythm. Mrs. Callahan served breakfast at 7:30. Victor arrived at 9 with files and recordings. Olivieri appeared and disappeared like a tide, sometimes in the study for hours, sometimes gone entirely, leaving behind only the faint residue of his cologne and a tension in the air that never fully dissipated. Jessie worked. It was the only word for it. She dissected conversations the way a surgeon dissects tissue. Carefully, methodically, aware that one wrong cut could collapse everything. Gerald Stein's voice threaded through dozens of recordings, and with each one, the picture sharpened. Stein wasn't just skimming, he was architecting. Over 18 months, he'd constructed a parallel financial structure. Shell companies layered like nesting dolls, payments disguised as vendor, invoices, a slow, meticulous hemorrhage of Trentino assets, into accounts that fed into a name Jessie couldn't yet reach. "He's not the top," she told Olivieri on the third morning, spreading her notes across the desk. "He's the mechanism. Someone is directing him. Someone who understands your organization well enough to know exactly how much can be taken without triggering alarms. How much? Based on the language patterns in these calls, the way he defers, the way he asks permission before acting, I'd estimate he reports to someone with political protection. He uses phrases like, 'The arrangement stands as discussed,' and 'Our mutual friend confirms.' That's diplomatic language. Whoever's above him isn't criminal. They're institutional." Olivieri sat across from her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the notes, beyond the desk, beyond the room. Jessie recognized that look. She'd seen it in survivors of domestic abuse, in veterans, in anyone who'd learned that the people closest to them were also the people most capable of destruction. "You trusted him," she said, not a question. "I trusted the structure," he replied. "I built it to be unbreakable, every layer verified, every man tested." His voice carried something she hadn't heard before. Not anger, but exhaustion. The weariness of a man who had spent his life building walls only to discover termites in the foundation. "Your structure isn't broken," Jessie said carefully. "One man is. That's not the same thing." He looked at her then. Really looked, not the analytical gaze of a boss evaluating an asset, but something raw, something briefly unguarded. "My father trusted his structure too," he said. "He built the family from nothing after leaving Sicily. Every alliance hand-chosen. every loyalty earned through blood and years. He paused. His fingers rested on the desk, perfectly still, but Jesse saw the tension. The tendons in his forearms drawn tight, like cables bearing weight. He was shot by his underboss at a dinner table, in his own house, with his wife in the next room. The study seemed to contract around them. "I was 14, Olivieri continued. His voice didn't change. Same measured cadence, same controlled delivery. But his breathing had shifted, deeper and slower, the way a person breathes when they're holding something in place by force. My mother never recovered. She lives upstate now, in a facility that costs more per month than your bar makes in a year. She doesn't recognize me most days." Jessie didn't speak. She understood, with the instinct that had governed her entire life, that this was not a moment for words. He wasn't confessing. He was explaining. Drawing a line from the boy who watched his father's blood pool on a dining room floor to the man who now sat in a fortress of his own making, trusting no one, sleeping lightly, checking every glass before he drank. Except he hadn't checked the glass. She had. "The flowers," Jessie said, softly. "Gerald sends your mother flowers. Every February, her birthday. He knows where she is." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, swollen with implication, with the terrible mathematics of betrayal, with the realization that the man who had been stealing from Olivieri also held the address of the only person Olivieri loved without condition. Olivieri stood abruptly. The chair scraped against hardwood. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, hands in his, pockets, shoulders a rigid line beneath the dark sweater. Jessie watched the muscles in his back shift as he breathed. She watched his reflection in the glass. His face stripped of its armor for just a moment, the mask cracking to reveal something underneath that looked like grief, or rage, or both. So tightly wound together they'd become the same thing. "I'll increase her security today," he said finally. Business voice, controlled. The door had closed again. But Jessie had seen through it, and she knew, the way she knew cadence and pitch and the silent language between words, that she could not unsee it. The most dangerous man in Chicago was also one of the most wounded, and the architecture of his entire empire was built not on ambition, but on the foundation of a 14-year-old boy's terror. That evening, she found him in the kitchen. It was nearly midnight. She'd come down for water and found him standing at the counter with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, staring at. Nothing with the fixed intensity of a man fighting a war inside his own skull. "You should sleep," she said from the doorway. "So should you." She walked in, poured herself water from the tap, leaned against the counter beside him, not close, but closer than she would have dared 2 days ago. The kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove, casting everything in warm gold. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Someone afraid." "I am afraid," she said. "I'm also useful, which is a better survival strategy than fear." That ghost of a smile again, the one that lived at the very corner of his mouth and never fully materialized. "You're remarkably honest for someone living in a captor's house. You're remarkably human for someone who runs a criminal empire." He turned his head. Their eyes met in the half-light, and for a moment, neither of them breathed. The space between them was 18 inches and infinite. She could see the pulse at his throat. Slow, steady, controlled, like everything about him. And she wondered, with a recklessness that terrified her, what it would take to make it race. "Go to sleep, Jessie," he said quietly. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else, darker, more deliberate, as though he was being careful with it. She went. But she carried the sound of it up the stairs and into her room, and into the space behind her closed eyes, where sleep still refused to come. 18 inches. In that moment, 18 inches had felt like the most dangerous distance in the world. The name arrived on the 6th day like a grenade with the pin pulled. Victor placed a single sheet of paper on Olivieri's desk at 9:14 in the morning. Jessie was already there, headphones around her neck, legal pad covered in annotations. She saw Victor's face first, gray, drawn, the careful composure of a man who had confirmed something he'd hoped was wrong. "Alderman Raymond Petty," Victor said. 32nd Ward, Finance Committee, connected to the Governor's Infrastructure Fund. Gerald's mutual friend. Jessie watched Olivieri read the name. He didn't react the way she expected. No explosion, no jaw clench, no controlled fury. Instead, something worse. Stillness. The absolute, terrifying stillness of a predator recalculating. "Petty has been laundering through the infrastructure fund for 6 years," Victor continued. "Gerald built the bridge. Trentino money flows into Shell. Companies. Shells feed Petty's campaign accounts. Petty provides political cover. When you started the audit last quarter, Gerald panicked. The thallium was Petty's solution. Remove you, install a successor Gerald can manage, keep the pipeline open. And the facilitator?" Olivieri's voice was flat, surgical. "Professional. Goes by Harlan. No last name we can find. Ex-military intelligence, private contractor. Petty hired him 18 months ago for..." And I'm quoting from an intercepted call. Jessie flagged. "Structural adjustments." Structural adjustments. The euphemism sat in the room like a corpse. "Harlan ran the thallium operation," Jessie said. She'd been tracing his voice through 7 recordings, a voice like sanded concrete, devoid of emotion, terrifyingly precise. He sourced the poison, recruited Marco, planned the timeline. But he's not loyal to Petty. He's loyal to the contract. Which means if Petty feels the walls closing in, Harlan becomes expendable. Or gets pointed at a new target. She met Olivieri's eyes. "Like me." The words landed between them. Olivieri's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A tectonic movement, deep and slow, the kind of shift that precedes earthquakes. "No one is touching you," he said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of physics, an immutable law he had decided to impose on the universe. The conviction in his voice made Jessie's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. But Harlan didn't operate on conviction. He operated on information. And 48 hours later, the information found Jessie. She was in the study, alone, cross-referencing financial documents Victor had obtained, when her borrowed phone, a prepaid device Olivieri had given her strictly for internal communication, vibrated with a message from an unknown number. "Clever girl. But you're in a house of glass, and I know where every wall is." Her blood turned to ice. She didn't scream, didn't run. She stared at the screen with the focused attention of someone disarming a bomb, cataloging every detail. The syntax, clean, no contractions, military-trained communication style. It was Harlan. He'd found her number, which meant he'd penetrated Olivieri's communication network, which meant Gerald wasn't the only breach. Jessie walked to Olivieri's private office on the 2nd floor. She knocked once and entered without waiting. He was on the phone, mid-sentence, and the look on her face stopped him. He ended the call without explanation. She placed the phone on his desk, screen up. She watched him read it. Watched the storm build behind his eyes. Dark, violent, barely contained. His hand closed around the phone, and for a moment she thought he'd crush it. "When?" he asked. 3 minutes ago." He stood, moved around the desk toward her. For the first time since she'd arrived, she instinctively stepped back, not from fear of him, but from the magnitude of what radiated from his. Body. Rage. Contained and pressurized. Hotter than anything she'd ever stood near. He stopped. Saw her step back. And something in him fractured. The rage didn't disappear. She could see it still, burning in the rigid line of his shoulders, the locked jaw, the veins visible at his temples. But layered over it, breaking through like light through storm clouds, was something devastated. He'd frightened her. Without touching her, without raising his voice, the force of what he was had made her retreat. Jessie. Her name, barely above a whisper. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, and meant it. "I'm afraid of what's happening around us. There's a difference." He stood very still, breathing through his nose, and she watched him do something she suspected he rarely did. Choose restraint not because it was strategic, but because she was standing in front of him, and he could not bear to be the thing that made her flinch. "I need to move," he said finally. "Gerald, Petty, Harlan, all of them at once. If I give them time, they'll—" "If you move on rage, you'll make mistakes," Jessie cut in. "That message was designed to provoke exactly this. Harlan wants you reactive. He wants you loud, visible, making moves that Petty can use to bring law enforcement down on your operation." Olivieri stared at her. She could see the war inside him. The 14-year-old boy who'd watched his father die and sworn never again, fighting the man who'd learned that control was survival. "You're asking me to wait," he said. "I'm asking you to be smarter than they think you are." The silence between them was electric, charged. He looked at her standing there in her borrowed clothes, in his house, in his world. A bartender from a South Side apartment who had no business being the voice of reason in a war between a mafioso, a politician, and a professional killer. And something in his expression softened with a vulnerability that made her throat ache. 3 days, he said. "I'll give you 3 days to find me every thread. After that, I move." She nodded. He reached out and took the phone from the desk. His fingers brushed hers. Neither of them pulled away. "He won't get near you," Olivieri said. "I don't care what it costs." Jessie held his gaze. "I know." And she did. That was the most terrifying part. Not Harlan's message, not the conspiracy closing in, not the glass walls of a house that suddenly felt fragile. It was the absolute certainty in her bones that Olivieri, Trentino, would burn his entire empire to the ground before he let anything happen to her. And that she didn't want him to. Jessie found the thread on the second day. It was buried in a recording from 4 months ago. A conversation between Gerald and a voice she'd cataloged as secondary, a mid-level associate named Caruso, who handled logistics for the Trentino ports. The conversation was about shipping manifests, mundane enough to have been dismissed by anyone not trained to listen the way. Jessie listened, but Caruso stuttered. Once, on a single word. Confirmed. The same word, the same stress fracture she'd identified in her first session. Caruso wasn't just logistics. He was Gerald's internal relay, the one who passed information up to Harlan without leaving electronic fingerprints. More importantly, Caruso was scheduled to meet Petty in person. Tomorrow night. A fundraiser at the Palmer House. $500 a plate. Political theater dressed in black tie. The kind of event where men like Alderman Raymond Petty shook hands with donors, while men like Caruso slipped envelopes into jacket pockets in the men's room. Jessie laid it all out on the study desk at 2 a.m. Recordings, transcripts, financial flows mapped on legal paper, a web of connections that started with a bartender's napkin and ended with a corrupt politician's fundraiser. Olivieri stood across from her, arms crossed, reading her work with the focus of a man studying a battlefield. "If Caruso meets Petty tomorrow, it's a direct link," Jessie said. "Right now, everything is circumstantial. Voices on recordings, financial patterns, my analysis. But a documented meeting between your internal leak and the politician who ordered your assassination. That's leverage. That's the kind of evidence that makes a man like Petty negotiate. Or the kind that makes him send Harlan to clean house, Olivieri replied. Which is why the meeting can't happen the way they planned. Jesse tapped the legal pad. Caruso doesn't know he's been identified. Gerald doesn't know we've traced the financial structure. As far as they're concerned, the investigation is still looking at Marco. A dead end, literally. We have one advantage. They think I'm irrelevant. You're not going anywhere near that fundraiser. I'm the only one who can identify Caruso's voice in real time. Your men don't know what to listen for. I do. I can be in the room with an earpiece, monitoring their conversation. And when Caruso passes the information, I flag it. Your people document it. You get your evidence, and Petty gets a noose he tied himself. Olivieri shook his head. Not in disagreement, in resistance. She could see it in the way his jaw worked, the way his hands gripped his own arms. He knew she was right. He also knew that putting her in that room meant putting her within reach of every threat he'd spent the last week trying to shield her from. If Harlan is there, he started, then I need to be someone he's not looking for. A caterer, a coat check girl, someone invisible. She held his gaze. I've been invisible my entire life, Olivieri. It's the one thing I'm better at than reading people. He stared at her for a long time. The study was quiet, except for the hum of the monitors and the distant sound of wind against the windows. If anything goes wrong, he said slowly, you leave. You don't stay to get more evidence. You don't try to be brave. You leave. I will. Promise me. The word hung between them. Promise. Weighted with everything neither of them had said. She saw it in his eyes. This wasn't a boss giving an operative instructions. This was a man asking a woman to stay alive, because somewhere in the last 6 days, her survival had stopped being strategic and started being personal. I promise, she said. The Palmer House ballroom glittered like the inside of a jewel box. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across 500 guests in their finest performance of respectability, and somewhere between the champagne towers and the string quartet, Jessie stood in a black catering uniform with an earpiece hidden beneath her hair and her heart hammering against her ribs. She spotted Caruso within 12 minutes, stocky, thinning hair, moving through the crowd with the practiced nonchalance of a man who'd done this before. He shook hands, smiled, and at 9:17, walked toward the east corridor. Jessie followed at a distance, tray in or hand invisible. The men's room. Petty was already there, tall, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that photographed well and concealed everything. Jessie positioned herself in the corridor, close enough for the microphone sewn into her lapel to catch the sound through the partially open door. Caruso's voice. Petty's voice. And then, a third voice. Low, flat, like sanded concrete. Harlan. Jessie's blood froze. He wasn't supposed to be here. The intelligence said Harlan operated remotely, never attending public events. But there he was, and through the crack in the door, Jessie caught a fragment of his face. Angular, clean-shaven, utterly forgettable. The face of a man designed to disappear. The bartender is still alive, Harlan said. That's a problem. She's locked in Trentino's house, Petty replied. She's irrelevant. No one locked in Trentino's house is irrelevant. She's been listening to recordings for 6 days. If she's half as sharp as Marco claimed before we disposed of him, she's already mapped the financial trail. Jessie's hands trembled. The tray vibrated faintly. She tightened her grip and kept breathing. Trentino moves on Gerald within the week. Harlan continued. When he does, we need the woman gone. Not arrested. Gone. The word landed like a blade. Jessie transmitted the recording, turned, and walked toward the exit with the calm, measured pace of someone carrying a tray of empty champagne glasses, not a death sentence. She made it to the service corridor before her knees buckled. And then a hand caught her, firm, warm, steadying. Olivieri materialized beside her, as though he'd been embedded in the walls, wearing a dark overcoat, his expression a controlled blaze of fury and relief. "I heard everything," he said. "We're leaving. Now." Olivieri. "Now, Jessie." In the car, she shook. Not dramatically. A fine, continuous tremor that ran from her shoulders to her fingertips, the kind of shaking that comes after adrenaline peaks, and the body realizes what the mind already knew. She had been standing 15 feet from a man who'd been ordered to make her disappear. Olivieri reached across the space between them. His hand closed over hers. Warm, steady, an anchor. "You were right," he said. "About everything. The meeting. The connection. Harlan's involvement. You gave us what we needed. They want me dead. They want a lot of things they're not going to get." She looked at their hands, his large, scarred at the knuckles, hers smaller, still trembling. And for the first time since the napkin, since the car, since the mansion, she let herself feel what she'd been holding at arm's length. She was not just useful to him. She was not just a witness, an asset, an analyst. She was someone he was willing to stand in a corridor for, invisible as a shadow, waiting to catch her if she fell. "Don't let go," she whispered. He didn't. The next 72 hours moved with the precision of a surgeon's hand. Olivieri didn't act on rage. He acted on everything Jessie had given him. The recordings, the financial maps, the transcripts, the voice analysis that traced every thread from Gerald Stein's careful embezzlement through Caruso's relay network to Alderman Petty's campaign accounts and Harlan's operational fees. He moved on all of them at once, the way Jessie had understood he would. Not with guns, but with architecture. The same mind that had built an empire from his father's blood now dismantled a conspiracy with surgical elegance. Gerald was detained at his home on Tuesday morning by two men he'd known for a decade. No violence, no threats. Just a quiet car ride to a warehouse on the south side, where Victor waited with printed records of every transaction, every call, every lie, laid out on a steel table like an autopsy. Gerald, confronted with the totality of his own betrayal, collapsed inward. He talked for 9 hours. He gave them everything. Account numbers, contact protocols, the name of every person Petty had compromised, and the location of Harlan's operational base, a rented apartment in Pilsen, paid through a shell company that traced back to the alderman's office. Jessie listened to the recording of Gerald's confession from the study, headphones on, legal pad in her lap. His voice was different now, stripped of its boardroom polish, its careful hedging language, reduced to the raw, cracking tone of a man who had gambled everything and lost. She noted the moment. His breathing changed. The exact second he understood that no amount of information would save him from what he'd done. She felt nothing resembling satisfaction, only the heavy, exhausted clarity of a puzzle completed. Caruso was next. Simpler. A man with less conviction and more fear, who surrendered his role in the network within 2 hours of being confronted. He'd been promised money and protection. He received neither. Harlan was harder. The apartment in Pilsen was empty when Olivieri's men arrived, cleaned with the professional thoroughness of someone trained to leave no trace. But Jessie had flagged something in the Palmer House recording that no one else had caught. A background sound, barely audible, a rhythmic clicking that she identified as a specific model of mechanical keyboard. Cross-referenced with Harlan's known communication patterns, it suggested a secondary location, somewhere he worked, not just lived. Victor's people found it 48 hours later. A rented office space above a laundromat in Bridgeport, where Harlan kept encrypted drives, communication equipment, and, crucially, a paper trail of direct payments from Petty's personal account. Not campaign funds, personal. The kind of evidence that no political fixer could explain away. Harlan was arrested by federal agents on a Thursday evening, walking out of a coffee shop on Halsted Street with a paper cup in one hand and, presumably, his next contract in his head. The FBI had received an anonymous package containing copies of everything: recordings, financial documents, Jesse's analysis, curated with enough precision to build a case without exposing the Trentino operation. Olivieri had given the feds their prize and kept his hands clean. It was, Jesse realized, a masterpiece of strategic restraint, the kind of move that required suppressing every violent instinct in favor of a longer, smarter game. Alderman Petty's arrest made the evening news 3 days later. Jesse watched it from the kitchen, standing beside Mrs. Callahan, who dried a plate with her usual silent efficiency, and said without looking up, "Good riddance." It was the most words Jesse had ever heard her speak at once. Olivieri found her in the study that night. She was packing her notes, the legal pads, the annotated transcripts, the linguistic maps she'd drawn over sleepless nights in his house. She was organizing them into a neat stack, the way you organize things when you're preparing to leave. He stood in the doorway and watched her. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Cleaning up." She didn't look at him. "Gerald's done. Petty's done. Harlan's in federal custody. You don't need a witness anymore." The silence was so complete she could hear the clock on his desk. A heavy, antique thing with a pendulum that swung with the same measured patience as the man who owned it. "Is that what you think you are?" he said. "A witness?" "That's what you called me. First night in the car. Your life is now my concern. Concern's been handled. Case closed." She stacked the last legal pad and finally turned. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. And that terrified her, because she could always read people. Always. It was the one thing she'd never failed at. But Olivieri Trentino stood there and was, for the first time, completely opaque to her. "You saved my life with a napkin," he said quietly. "You dismantled a conspiracy that my entire organization missed. You stood 15 feet from a man who wanted you dead and didn't flinch. I flinched. You caught me." "Yes, I did." He uncrossed his arms, took one step into the room, and I have no intention of stopping. The space between them collapsed slowly, not with the urgency of passion, but with the gravitational inevitability of two objects that had been circling each other, and finally yielded to the pull. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, faster than his composure suggested, faster than she'd ever seen it, close enough to see the fracture lines in his armor, the places where the man bled through the boss. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I know how to protect. I know how to control. I don't know how to ask someone to stay. You're doing it right now. Am I? Your pulse is elevated. Your breathing is shallow. You crossed your arms to create a barrier, and then uncrossed them, because you decided to stop protecting yourself from this conversation." She managed a small, trembling smile. "I told you. I read people." "You read everyone," he said. "Can you read this?" He reached out. His hand cupped the side of her face, gently, with a care that seemed almost foreign to hands that had done the things his hands had done. His thumb traced the dark circle beneath her eye, the mark of every sleepless night she'd spent in his house, in his war, in the orbit of his gravity. "Stay," he said. "Not as a witness, not as an analyst. Stay because this house has been empty for a long time, and you're the first person who made it feel like something other than a fortress." Jesse leaned into his hand. The warmth of his palm against her cheek was the first warmth she'd felt since arriving that hadn't come from the building's radiant heat. This was human. Specific. His. "I'll stay," she said. but not because you asked, because I choose to." He kissed her the way he did. Everything. Deliberately. Completely. With the full weight of his attention focused on a single point. And Jessie, who had spent her entire life reading the distance between what people said and what they meant, found for the first time that there was no distance at all. 3 months later, the study looked different. Jessie's legal pad still covered the desk, but now they shared space with linguistics journals, a second monitor, and a mug that read, "World's Okayest Analyst," a gift from Victor, whose skepticism had evolved into something that, if you squinted, resembled respect. She'd enrolled in a graduate program in forensic linguistics at the University of Chicago, a field she hadn't known existed until she'd lived it. Olivieri had offered to pay. She'd declined. He'd offered again. She'd told him she'd accept a loan at market interest rate, and he'd laughed. A real laugh, the kind that transformed his face into something younger, lighter, closer to the boy he'd been. Before the dining room floor turned red, Gerald Stein was serving 12 years. Caruso had testified in exchange for witness protection. Alderman Petty's trial was set for spring, and the evidence was overwhelming. Thanks in part to an anonymous linguistic analysis that the prosecution's expert witness had called the most meticulous voice attribution work I've ever seen, Harlan had pled guilty. His sentence was classified. Jessie didn't ask details. Olivieri's mother still lived upstate, but the room on the 3rd floor, the one that had been locked, the one Jessie had noticed but never asked about, was open now. He'd turned it into a reading room. On the shelf, beside first editions and financial reports, sat a framed napkin with 2 words in black ink. "Don't drink." It was, he told her once, the most valuable thing he owned. On a Sunday morning in March, Jessie woke to the sound of rain and the smell of coffee. Olivieri was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter in a dark sweater with his sleeves rolled up, reading something on his phone with the quiet focus that she now recognized not as menace, but as his natural state. A man who processed the world in silence before deciding how to act in it. She leaned against the doorframe, watched him, read the ease in his shoulders, the unclenched jaw, the way he looked up when he sensed her presence, and his eyes softened in a way that no one else in his world would ever see. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He set down his phone, poured her coffee, 1 sugar, splash of cream, a precision he'd learned without being told, because he observed people too, in his own way. Mrs. Callahan left scones. Mrs. Callahan is a national treasure. She sat across from him at the kitchen island, the same island where she'd sat on her first morning, terrified, wearing a borrowed sweater, wondering how a napkin had landed her in a mafioso's kitchen. The same counter, the same light, but nothing was the same. She was not a bartender anymore. She was not a prisoner. She was not invisible. She was the woman who had saved the most dangerous man in Chicago with 2 words, and then saved him again with every word after. Jessie once believed that her gift was a liability, the thing that made people uncomfortable, that ended relationships, that kept her isolated behind a wall of perception no one else could see through. But maybe that's the thing about the parts of ourselves we try to hide. Maybe they're not flaws at all. Maybe they're the exact thing someone else needs. The sharp eye, the steady hand, the 2 words on a napkin that changed the course of a life. And Olivieri? He learned that the strongest fortress in the world is useless if there's no one inside worth protecting. That power without connection is just a more expensive kind of loneliness, and that sometimes the person who saves you isn't carrying a weapon. She's carrying a pen. Maybe that's what trust really is, not the absence of danger. Just the willingness to let someone see your glass before you drink. If this story left something stirring in your chest, we'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment with your thoughts. We read every single one, and your words keep these stories alive. Hit like if you believe that the sharpest instinct is sometimes the quietest one, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you new emotional journeys every single day. Before you go, check out the next video on screen or explore our playlist for more tales of love, courage, and the redemption hiding in the most dangerous places. Thank you for being here tonight. Stay safe, stay sharp, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is slide a note to a stranger and hope they read it in time. Good night.